Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of everything I've ever learned about the original Xbox. In this part, I'm going to be talking about all the various motherboard revisions that exist for the system. Well, first of all, what is a motherboard revision? Basically, if an electronic product will be on the market for a few years, a company may decide to continue minor development on their logic boards to fix known issues. Despite quality control, there may be some issues that are hard to spot without actually launching the product. After a machine gets heavy use and enough time passes, engineers will be able to understand what the weakest links are and try to fix them in a cost-effective way. Sometimes general improvements can be made within the same brand. For example, it's known that a certain revision of Nintendo Wii's actually has a faster disk drive, which saves a few seconds on average with each loading screen. Because the changes are so minor, all of the difference happens under the hood, and they don't warrant a brand new product. This isn't like the iPhone 4 and the 4S. There are no advertised benefits that come with each revision. Therefore, you can buy an Xbox in 2001 and 2005, and they will both function and look exactly the same on the outside. But the motherboards might be a little bit different. These differences will be mainly relevant if you intend to mod the system in any way. There are a total of 7 known motherboard revisions for the Xbox. Here's a quick rundown of each one. Alright, here's a picture of a 1.0 motherboard. This is the first one that came out. It launched the Xbox. So what we got here is a few things that are going to change. So let me kind of take you through a tour of the whole thing so that you'll notice the changes a little bit better later on. So zooming in a bit, we have our CPU over here. That doesn't really change. And you have your GPU over here. Now, the GPU is the easiest way to tell if you have a 1.0 because it's the only version that has this really tiny fan blowing on top of it. So it has an active cooling unit instead of a passive cooling unit. So this little fan plugs directly onto the main board over here. And of course that will change later, I'll get to that. So you have your big fan over here, dead giveaway that it's a 1.0. Up here you have a video chip, it's very important. This is a video encoder chip made by Connexent. Now versions 1.0 to 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3 all use the Connexent video encoder. That's a very useful way of identifying which Xbox you have is by looking at this chip right here. So as soon as you see Connexent, you know it's between 1.0 and 1.3. Obviously, you see this, you know it's a 1.0. So up here, here's your AV port. This is where you plug in your TV cables. Over here is your fan header for your main system fan, the larger one that sits right over here. Over here you have your broadband Ethernet port over here, so when you would have wanted to play Xbox Live or if you modded the system, this is how you transfer files in and out through here. Over here, this port is your power plug for your DVD drive. So your DVD drive will both need to be powered from here with a cable, and will also need a data cable, which is this port over here. This is a standard IDE PC cable, or rather plug. So in standard desktop computers, you would have one cable, or at least during the time this was made, you would have one IDE cable which plugs into the motherboard, and then it would reach on over to plug into a secondary drive like a DVD drive or a floppy disk drive, and then your actual hard drive. So those two devices both use the same plugs and the same cable to be connected. And all of that data goes in here, in this plug. Moving on, we move on down to this peculiar area here. You'll notice this little rectangle with a bunch of solder holes, and it'll say LPC debug. So that's basically what this is. It's an LPC debug port. When the system was new, this was a way for Xbox developers to get into the system, mainly the BIOS, and troubleshoot it, or do some debugging. If there was any debugging that needed to be done, they would do it from here. They would solder in their own programming devices, and then they would get into the system. If you already know your way around here, that's because you're probably into modding. So anyone who's ever installed a mod chip for the system has installed it here. This is where all the mod chips get soldered into. Moving along. Here we have the famous clock capacitor of death. Kind of a fearful name, but here it is. Capacitor everyone's been talking about. This little fucker over here. So this capacitor, I'm going to cover this in a later video too, a little bit more in depth. But this capacitor has an 100% chance of failing. No one really knows why they're just so faulty, but this one in particular, its only job is to tell time. So when you power on your Xbox for the first time, or if it's been unplugged for a while, it's going to ask you to input the time and date on the dashboard. Once you do, and you keep it plugged in, this capacitor should store enough energy, enough electricity to keep the time going so that you don't have to enter it every single time you power on your Xbox. That's all well and fine, but over the years, people have figured out that this thing just up and fails, and that no matter what, every time they power on the machine, they get asked to input the time and date again and again and again. When they open up their system, they find that this capacitor is leaking on the board, actually leaking electrolytic fluid right onto top of all these lovely resistors over here. And if enough time passes, it actually can corrode these resistors and these traces over here, and it will actually destroy your Xbox. So long story short, this thing is dangerous and should be removed, but like I said, I'll cover that in a later video where I go over all the common repairs that I've done. So save that in your brain for later. Moving on over. We have these two ports over here. These are plugged into by something called a daughter board. And what goes into the daughter board are the controller ports. So every Xbox has 4 controller ports, obviously, but on the inside they're all divided into pairs. So port 1 and 2 get combined into a single plug, and port 3 and 4 get combined into another plug. So if you unplug one of them, you actually lose 2 ports. But they don't actually plug into the main motherboard. They plug into a daughter board, which is a separate thing, and that thing plugs into the motherboard through these two black ports over here. That will be changed in a later revision, but I'll get to that. This white port over here is your front panel power port. So your front panel contains a small circuit board that has your power and reset buttons, and that is connected through this port over here. So if you have this unplugged, your power button and reset button will do nothing. So always remember to plug that back in. Lastly, I want to point out this motherboard power connector. So your power supply is going to sit right here in this area in your system, and there's a very large connector that's going to reach over and plug right into here. Notice that it's a single row of pins. That will change in a later revision. So that's one way you can tell if it's an earlier Xbox revision. Anyways, so that's where you plug in your motherboard power. Again, if you leave that unplugged, your system's not going to turn on. So pretty much all of it needs to be plugged in. Pretty much all of it. And I think that does it. So that's a 1.0 motherboard. A little bit more information about this one. Because it has an extra fan in it running all the time, it's going to be a little bit noisier than other systems. And it does run a little bit hotter from my experience, but it's not anything too major. I can't say I've ever had a problem with the heating. It's just a little bit warmer. Another thing I want to mention is that this is, again, the first motherboard that came out, so they also have had the longest time to suffer from this deadly capacitor. So the likelihood of seeing a functioning 1.0 board is declining every day because they've had the most use, the most wear and tear, and time has been a little bit cruel on them. So one last thing I gotta talk about is that the 1.0 is all shipped with a Thomson DVD drive. This is rated to be the worst DVD drive you can possibly have with the original Xbox due to its incredibly high failure rate. It's definitely a really shitty brand to have, and you definitely want a Samsung drive or even a Philips drive over the Thomsons any day. These have a very high failure rate, and you definitely want to avoid them. One way of checking to see which DVD drive you have without opening up your system is to look at the tray, because the tray is different across all versions. So check out this diagram to figure out which DVD drive you might have. Something that's really important that I forgot to mention is that the power supplies have their own revisions and brand changes. The only thing you need to know is which power supply goes with which motherboard. They absolutely need to be matched with the correct ones or you're going to risk some serious damage. So as you can see, the following supplies can be swapped within the same group. So 1.0s and 1.1s use the same power supply. 1.2s and beyond use the same power supply, but 1.6s use their own that can only be used on a 1.6 motherboard. So never ever swap them around willy-nilly, you have to know what you're doing. Alright, I want to move on to version 1.1, and keep in mind this picture is not of a 1.1, but we're just going to use it as an example so I can point out all the changes. So in 1.1, they feature a significant improvement. The GPU no longer has the fan on top of it. Instead, it has a larger heatsink, which looks just like that. The daughter board for the controllers is gone, so the controllers just plug directly into the board. It's much less clutter and it's so much easier to disassemble, so that's all well and good. It uses the same video encoder and all that stuff, so the rest will be the same, but 1.1 is a pretty good improvement in my opinion. Alright, version 1.2. All previous changes apply here, of course. Now we introduce a Philips DVD drive, which is miles better than the Thomson. We have a Western Digital hard drive, and now for our motherboard power connector, we have a double row of pins instead of a single row of pins. So this will let you know that you're on a 1.2 or above. The only versions that have a single row is 1.0 and 1.1. For version 1.3, we introduced the Samsung DVD drive and a second Seagate hard drive. Nothing else to really report, that's kind of it. Alright, version 1.4. Here the biggest difference is that we have a new video encoder chip called Focus. These mostly shipped with Samsung DVD drives, and these were produced quite heavily, making them a very common revision to stumble upon. In my time repairing Xboxes, 1.4s were definitely the most common Xboxes I would find. And that's not a bad thing. This is a very solid revision. I mean, we have all the other positive revisions of the other ones, but this one's a lot more common to find. The Samsung DVD drives are good, so if you would ever want an Xbox for your own, I would definitely recommend a 1.4. 1.5 is an interesting story. It's extremely rare, and it's doubted to even exist. So many sources on the internet say that it was possibly a manufacturing mistake, and since production of 1.5s were cut very short, and they resumed making 1.4s, it's doubtful that this was ever an intentional revision. There's no visual method to even distinguish a 1.5 from a 1.4. Version 1.5 has power and ground disconnected from the LPC debug port to discourage modding. So if you want to see if it's a 1.5, you have to measure if pin number 2 on the LPC bus is connected to the ground plane. If it's not, then it's probably a 1.5. And it's kind of a weird thing for me. A part of me is saying there's no evidence for 1.5s. You've never seen it in real life or on the internet. No one's claimed that they have one and shown proof. So they don't exist. It's not a real revision. But the other part of me is saying, if even one of these exists and it's out there, that's one small change that they made to the board, so it should officially count. But I mean, like I said, I've never seen one before. I don't know anyone who has. So I really don't ever consider 1.5s to be something to think about. It's just not relevant to anyone. And now we arrive at the final revision, version 1.6. Came out around 2004, 2005. And this features many significant changes, some good, some bad. Let's talk about some of the good changes. So they included a stronger clock capacitor that's no longer a threat to the board, so that's good. You don't need to remove it. But if you do remove it, it does need to be replaced, however, because the Xbox will not boot up without it. That's a major difference between the other revisions and 1.6. 1.6 actually needs the clock capacitor in there in order to boot up. So if you do remove it, you do need to replace it with another one. Another positive change is that some of them feature a Hitachi DVD drive, which are definitely on the higher end of DVD brands that you want for your Xbox. These are going to last you a long time. They're not very prone to sticking and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, there are some real blunders on this board that I want to talk about. A lot of it has to do with this new video encoder chip called Excalibur. Now this encoder breaks 480p support for a huge number of games, I think over 15 games. It's a specific number of games too, specific titles that you cannot play in 480p. If you do try to play it in 480p, you'll get a scrambled screen and you can't see shit. It's unplayable. So some 480p workarounds exist for a few games, but they require you to have a modded Xbox. It cannot be done on a vanilla machine. Another problem is that the LPC debug port has had its power and data lines removed. If you wanted to wire in a mod chip, you have your work cut out for you, since all those lines need to be wired back together. This is known as an LPC rebuild. While it's not impossible, it doesn't look very fun. All it is instead of your usual mod chip process, you have to wire in 5 more wires than normal. So it's just a little bit extra work. Lastly, the TSOP chip, which I'll explain in another video, which holds the system BIOS, is no longer rewritable. So each system has a BIOS that's located on this chip called the TSOP. And on 1.6, you cannot rewrite it. So any mods involving TSOP flashing cannot be done on a 1.6. I'll cover all this a lot more in depth in my modding videos. Essentially, if you wanted a hard modded 1.6 console, you need to use a mod chip. You cannot use a TSOP flash. In all other versions, you can use a TSOP flash, which achieves the same results that a mod chip would make. If you don't want to open up your Xbox, you can check which motherboard revision you have by looking at your serial number, which is located on the bottom of your Xbox. You can also check the manufacturing date, as that will also give you a really good idea of which revision it is. I've put a link in the description of the original Xbox subreddit, and they have a really good wiki there that will give you more tips on how to identify your Xbox without opening it up. Here's a really fast way to figure it out if you do open up your Xbox. If it has a GPU fan, it's a 1.0. If it doesn't have a GPU fan, but it does have a single row of pins on the motherboard power connector, it's a 1.1. If you have a double row of pins on the power connector, and you have a connection chip, it's probably a 1.2 or a 1.3. If you have a focused video encoder, it's probably a 1.4. If you have an Excalibur video encoder, it's probably a 1.6. So which version is the best? Well, I think they're all fine for most people. All versions can be soft modded if so desired. If you aren't playing these games on a high definition screen, you may not care about the 1.6's limitations on 480p games. If you are though, you will probably want any Xbox that's not a 1.6. Version 1.0 and 1.1 have more options for a custom BIOS. They offer more options for RAM upgrades and other enthusiast projects that normal people wouldn't really care about. For the average user who just wants to play some Xbox games on a cool modded system, I'd go with anything from a 1.1 to a 1.4. You're most likely to get a better DVD drive with those versions, and you'll have a quieter system than a 1.0. And you'll get full 480p support for the entire library. And you have more options for hard mods. You can go with a mod chip, or you can do a T-stop flash. Alright, I think that does it. I think that's everything that I know about Xbox motherboard revisions. Stay tuned for part 3, where I'm going to go into all the common repairs that I've done for the console, and some tips for how to make it last a long time and make sure it's not going to crap out on you. Alright, thanks for watching.